It's 4 p.m., it's 95 degrees outside, and you're standing in front of an open refrigerator door, just letting the cold air hit your face for a second longer than necessary. You grab something cold to drink. You go find the room with the air conditioning vent. This is what a hot day looks like for you. It is, for almost everyone reading a script like this, a minor inconvenience solved in about 4 seconds by a machine plugged into a wall. Now picture a different afternoon. Same heat, actually worse. No wall socket, because there is no electricity. No fridge, because refrigeration is 3,000 years away. You're standing on sand that could blister bare feet wearing linen, about to spend the next several hours doing physical labour outdoors. And you are not miserable. You are not gritting your teeth through some heroic act of endurance. You're just having a normal day, one you'll have again tomorrow and the day after, for the rest of a life that, by the standards of the ancient world, counts as a long one. That's the strange part. A civilization built itself for 3,000 years inside one of the most punishing climates on the planet, with no technology we would recognize as climate control, and somehow made it look ordinary, not survived, ordinary. So here's the actual question worth asking, not how did they survive the heat, because that framing assumes they were constantly fighting it. The real question is, how do you turn a lethal climate into a livable one, permanently, without a single machine that plugs in? To answer that, we have to start with the one piece of equipment nobody thinks about, the body itself. You are, biologically speaking, a cooling system with legs. When your internal temperature climbs, your body pushes water to the surface of your skin, and as that water evaporates, it pulls heat away with it. That's the entire mechanism. Other animals improvise around the edges. Dogs pant. Elephants flap their ears like radiators. Humans just sweat, and we're absurdly good at it. Millions of sweat glands, more efficient heat shedding than almost anything else in the animal kingdom. But every cooling system needs fuel, and this one runs on something you have to keep replacing. Lose a small percentage of your body's water, and your focus starts slipping. Lose more, and the danger isn't just thirst, it's confusion. Because one of the first things extreme heat takes from a person is the ability to notice something is wrong. There's a second ingredient people forget entirely: salt. Sweat carries it out of you, and if you replace the water without replacing the sodium, you can drink until your stomach hurts and still collapse. So the entire survival equation for a civilization living in one of the hottest inhabited places on Earth comes down to 3 unglamorous jobs, done every single day for thousands of years. Keep the heat out, keep the water coming in, keep the salt coming in too. Everything else is just increasingly clever variations on those 3 jobs. Start with the house, because this is where it gets quietly brilliant. Egyptian homes were built from mud brick, river silt, and chopped straw pressed into moulds, and baked in the same sun they were meant to defeat. Thick mud brick doesn't block heat, it delays it. The sun pounds the outer wall all day, and that heat crawls inward so slowly that it doesn't arrive inside until well after dark, right when the desert night has finally cooled off and you actually want a little warmth. Meanwhile, the cold of the night is creeping through in the other direction, arriving indoors around midday, exactly when you need relief the most. Nobody in this period was calculating thermal lag with equations. They just noticed, generation after generation, that thick walls made a house livable and thin ones didn't, and they built accordingly for 3,000 years. Then the smaller details stack on top. Windows sat high and small, because heat rises and you want an exit near the ceiling. Walls were whitewashed to throw sunlight back off the surface instead of soaking it in. Streets in working settlements were narrow enough that buildings shaded each other for most of the day. And the roof, flat by design, doubled as a bedroom. On brutal nights, entire households moved their sleeping mats upward into open air that actually moved, under a sky that held no heat at all. Sleeping under the stars wasn't a hardship here, it was the better option. Some homes went a step further, with a hooded vent built into the roofline, angled to catch the prevailing wind, and funnel it down into the rooms below, while hot air escaped through the high windows on the opposite side. No motor, no moving parts, just a pressure difference built out of geometry. And in some households, a porous clay jar of water sat directly in that incoming airflow. Water seeping through the clay evaporated off the surface, and the air brushing past it arrived in the room already cooled. That is, mechanically, the same principle sitting inside a modern evaporative cooler. They built it from a hole and a pot. Clothing followed the same logic, and it runs against instinct. The impulse in extreme heat is to wear as little as possible, but the Egyptians mostly covered up, and the reasoning holds up under scrutiny. Linen, woven from flax, is a strange, useful fabric. Its fibres are hollow, so air moves through it. It pulls moisture off the skin and spreads it wide, so sweat evaporates faster instead of sitting there uselessly. And it barely insulates, so it doesn't trap the heat you're trying to shed. Loose, pale linen over skin blocks direct sun, while still letting evaporation happen underneath, which beats bare skin baking directly in it. Quality varied enormously by class. Near-transparent linen for the wealthy, coarse, thick weaves, or almost nothing at all for field labour. But the underlying physics served everyone the same way. Even the shaved heads and wigs common among wealthier Egyptians weren't purely cosmetic. A wig sits slightly off the scalp, leaving a ventilated gap of air, and unlike hair, it can be taken off entirely to cool and clean the head underneath. Now the water problem, and it's messier than it sounds, because the obvious answer, drink from the Nile, was not actually safe. The river carried silt, waste and parasites well documented in the tissue of preserved bodies from the period. So the everyday drink of choice was beer, thick, low in alcohol, brewed from barley or emmer wheat, closer to a nutritious gruel than anything you'd recognize by the name today. The brewing process involved heat and fermentation, both of which happen to be hostile to a lot of the pathogens lurking in untreated river water. It carried calories, B vitamins and hydration all at once, and it was so structurally important that it appears in payment records for labourers as standard compensation, alongside bread. Documented labour disputes from this period, preserved on limestone flakes by workers who wrote down their daily grievances, record protests when those rations arrived late. That's not a footnote about ancient beer culture. That's what happens when you interrupt somebody's cooling system. Salt arrived almost by accident through a diet already leaning that direction. Bread gritty enough with ground stone that it visibly wore down teeth over a lifetime. Preserved salted fish, dates and figs for potassium, and natron, a naturally occurring salt compound pulled from dry lake beds and used throughout daily life, not only in the embalming process it's more famous for. Nobody involved understood electrolyte balance. They understood, generation after generation, which foods made the afternoon survivable and which didn't, and they kept the former. And then there's the simplest move of all, the one that looks almost too obvious to count as a strategy: timing. Heavy labour happened before dawn and after the sun dropped. The middle of the day, the genuinely dangerous stretch, was reserved for rest, shade and sleep. Even large-scale construction projects appear to have followed the rhythm of the Nile's annual flood. When farmland went underwater, farm labour paused, and moving heavy stone by boat suddenly became far easier. The workday, the work year and daily life itself were built around the sun and the river rather than fought against them. Here's where the story turns, though, because so far this has all been about defence, one long list of ways to blunt a hostile environment. But the desert wasn't only an obstacle. It was, in a very real sense, the reason any of this survived to be studied at all. Ancient Egyptians drew a hard line between the fertile black soil along the river and the lifeless red land beyond it, and that red land functioned as a wall no army could easily cross, no supply chain could stretch through. It brought the culture something rare in the ancient world, centuries of relative continuity, while neighbouring regions changed hands over and over. And that same punishing dryness is the reason organic material from this period exists at all. Papyrus, linen, wood, human tissue, all of it rots quickly in humidity and survives for millennia in dry sand. The climate that made daily life difficult is the same climate that kept the record of that life intact long enough for anyone today to read it. So the heat wasn't simply endured, it got put to work. It guarded the borders, it preserved the archive. It even shaped how the dead were prepared, since the practice of drying and preserving a body began as an imitation of something the desert already did on its own to anything left in dry sand. What's actually remarkable, looking back at all of it, is that none of it came from a single flash of genius. A thick wall, a vent aimed at the wind, a jar of water sitting in a breeze, a schedule bent around sunrise and sunset. None of these ideas required a breakthrough. They required attention, repeated over thousands of years, with each generation quietly keeping what worked and dropping what didn't, until the accumulated result looked, from the outside, like it had been engineered by someone with a physiology textbook. It hadn't been. It had been noticed slowly by people who were paying very close attention to their own discomfort. Which brings us back to that open refrigerator door. Your solution to a hot afternoon is a machine that cools one room by pumping heat outside it, into the street, into a city already getting warmer because everyone else's machine is doing the same thing. It works, but it's a local fix bolted onto a problem the surrounding world was never actually redesigned to solve. The house in ancient Thebes didn't fight the heat in one room and dump the problem outside. The whole structure, the walls, the roof, the airflow, the diet, the schedule, was the solution. Working together, needing nothing but mud, wind and salt to keep running. You'll get hot again today. You'll reach for something cold, find some shade, wait out the worst of the afternoon, all without really thinking about it. That's the same body, the same sweat glands, the same narrow margin before things start to go wrong that someone in Thebes was managing 33 centuries ago. They just had better architecture. Somewhere under all that sand, a wall is still holding on to yesterday's cool, waiting for tonight.